This
And
conference will now be recorded.
like I said, thank you for joining us. And let us get started with Sfirat Omer, the counting of the Omer. Time. Time is a fascinating topic. Bereshit, the very first word of the Torah, implies that part of the creation was Bereshit, was beginning, meaning only when there is time do we have a beginning and an end. Bereshit, creation, time is a realm that we are entrapped within. It is one of the rules of the game, so to speak, that Hashem made when he created this world of this world, when he created the physical world. When people say, well, everything came from God, or where does God come from? Right? So that's a question that's asking within the game. God is beyond the game, meaning time is a realm that God created, that placed us in. Within this realm of time, we have the question, well, when did it begin? What was before that? Whereas when it comes to God, God is beyond the realm of time. And therefore, you can't say, well, when did God begin? Begin is within the realm of time. And like I said before, we are so enmeshed in this realm of time that we can't think beyond it. Rabbi David Foreman puts it very well. He describes it that shoe says to iron, do you believe in Parker? Meaning in the Monopoly game, the shoe says to the iron, I've been around this board many times, passed go, collected 200. I've been to jail, got out of jail free. I've bought properties. Do you believe in Parker? Right? Because on the side of the board it says made by Parker Brothers. Now, if you're looking for Parker within the game that he created, within the rules of the game that he find Parker. Parker is beyond the game. Parker is beyond the board. Parker is beyond the rules that he created. He created those rules for the game. But those rules, those parameters don't apply to Parker. Right? In the game, it can only move if you roll the dice. Parker moves through life without rolling the dice. Parker is not bound by the rules of the game. One of the rules of the world that God created is time. God is not bound by the rules of time, and therefore asking, well, who created God? When did God begin? Is like saying, how did Parker fund this game if he didn't pass go and collect 200 each time? Where did he get the money for this game if he didn't pass go? Right? One is within the system, one is beyond the system. And we mentioned before when we were discussing Pesach that the Egyptian was a polytheistic society. And of course, monotheism is the truth. But Rabbi Sachs says very beautifully, it's not that polytheism is many gods and monotheism is one God. And I'll explain more in a moment. And that's why he says science doesn't replace religion. Science replaces polytheism, meaning it's not the rain god, it's the condensation. It's not the ocean god, it's the waves and the gravitational pulls that have, right, or this movement under the ocean floor that creates waves or tsunamis. It's not, science replaces polytheism, but that's all within the system. Monotheism is not many gods as opposed to one God. It's many gods working within the system as opposed to Parker, if I may, as opposed to the creator that is beyond the entire system and orchestrates the system and creates the rules and suspends the rules when he sees fit. So that is the questions that we have about God and time is all because we are locked within time. But we are locked within time. And we have to appreciate that. And perhaps we are locked in within time to make sure that we do appreciate the power of every moment, because every moment that we have, that we are alive, is actually a gift. It is a gift of time. We can't trade it. It remains the same. Its potential is infinite, but that all depends on how we use it. We begin counting the Omer, and we'll discuss further, of course, what that is soon. We begin that on the day after the Exodus from Egypt, because for a slave, the time is not their own. When we were enslaved in Egypt, the Egyptian overlords told us exactly how and when and we could use our time. Time was not our own. We had no way to direct those minutes and hours and days and weeks and months that make up our lives. But Pesach came, the Exodus, and now we were free, and now the time was our own. And we now had this mitzvah to count the days until Shavuot, when we would receive the Torah. That's the Shavuot holiday coming up in June. By counting each day separately, we recognize how valuable each day is. A day that goes by without meaningful accomplishments has died, has been squandered. It'll never come back. Every day has its unique meaning and potential, and the counting of the Omer reminds us that we have to utilize that. And by counting in the days passing, right, today is the 12th day of the Omer, it makes us realize that uncomfortable but so important realization. Time is passing. The hours of life are ticking by. And we have to make sure that we are utilizing our time in the best way possible. The Chavetz Chaim gives a fantastic mashal, a parable, that at times a person says, he gives it discussing, let's say a person is davening, is praying, and says the realizes towards the end that they have lost focus, that they haven't really been paying attention. He compares to what they're saying, to what they've been mouthing. He compares that to a person who's walking along on a hike with a backpack and diamonds in the bag. And towards the end of the hike, she realizes, oh no, there's a hole in the bottom of this backpack. And stones have been dropping out as I've been walking. What does a person do? Might as well throw out the last couple of stones. No, the person grabs those stones and makes sure that those will not slip away. The Chavetz Chaim says so too when it comes to our prayer. If we haven't been concentrating, you caught yourself, great. Grab the remaining gems, those diamonds, and make sure that you are concentrating, that you are best utilizing your time. And with life also, I'm sure all of us look back and say, oh, that was some time that was squandered. But we have to say, fair enough. Let's grab those diamonds and move forward. Sfiras Omer is meant to remind us time passes by. The Rolling Stones sang, time waits for no one. And we have to recognize that, appreciate that, and make sure that we are using our time. Let us go to the first source, which speaks about the Torah commandment of counting the Omer. Now, people often confuse, and we're not going to go into it today, maybe we'll at a later time, confuse an aspect of Sfira to Omer, an overlay of Sfira to Omer that came about at a later point, which is the aspects of mourning that we have. But that is not the mitzvah of Sfira to Omer. That is an overlay of events that took place meaningfully during this time period. But again, let's deal with the mitzvah, the Torah mitzvah of counting the Omer. So source number one in Vayikra is where the Torah tells us. Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor. God spoke to Moshe saying, Daber b'nei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel. V'amar to them and say to them, Ki tavo el haaretz, when you will come to the land, Asher ani notein lachem, that I'm giving to you, uketzartem et ktsira, you will reap the harvest, va'avetem et Omer reshit ktsirchem el hakohen. You will bring the Omer of the first of your harvest to the Kohen. Ve'inif et ha'omer. He shall wave this Omer lifnei Hashem before God, lirtzonchem, to be an appeasement on your behalf. Mimacharat Shabbat, the day after the Shabbat, and here Shabbat is referring to the first day of Pesach. The day after Pesach, yanifenu ha-kohen. Then the Kohen will wave it. Before any new grown grains, any of the 5 grains could be eaten, the equivalent of 1 day's worth of food of barley was brought to the base, the Mishkan or the base of Midrash later on the 2nd day of Pesach. That is this offering. And after that offering was brought, then one was able to eat from what's called the Chadash, from the new grains. Now, everything that was done in the temple, in the Beis HaMikdash, was filled with meaning and significance. So what is this teaching us? What is the idea of this mitzvah? What is the message of the Omer? So the Chizkuni, source number 2, explains, Ein derech eretz. It's not derech eretz. Derech eretz means basic respect, civility. It's not derech eretz shetochlim min hachadash. If you're eating from the new grain, the new harvest, ad shetaviu mimenu doron, before bringing a gift from it, le hakadosh baruch hu, to God. And this is a very, very important concept. We recognize that everything that we have, whether it's our assets, our success, our acumen, everything that we have is a gift that comes from God. So we're at the beginning of the harvest, and a lot of work has gone into this. It's been labor intensive, and we're first starting to reap the fruits of our labor. Before we partake of that, we bring to our benefactor, we bring an offering to the one who has given us all of this, to recognize that with all of our work, this is a gift from God. You know, they jokingly tell the story that a person challenges God to a duel, and God says, "You're on, bring it on." So the person says, "Okay, you create some growth and I'll create some growth." So Hashem creates this incredible tree that grows. The person says, "No big deal." He takes a seed and starts to plant it. God says, make your own seed. Incredible. In that little seed is all of the genetic instructions for it to multiply and multiply and grow and grow and grow and grow until you have a redwood. Incredible. Incredible. So with all of our efforts, which are needed and are important and are appreciated, we always have to remember ultimately where it comes from. So as the Chizkuni explains, we're about to start partaking of the new harvest. Before you do, pay your dues. Recognize, force yourself to recognize from where it has come. Source number 3, the Siftei Chaim, explains further. We'll go right to the English. In order that a person, Cheryl, I think your chavrusa is talking. We have to quiet. I'm going to mute you. I apologize,
Sorry.
Cheryl. No problem. I'm glad your puppy's enjoying the class also. In order that a person should not, God forbid, think, Kochi v'otzem yadi, asali et hachayil hazeh. A person should not mistakenly think that it is my strength, my might, my strength in my hands that has produced all of this for me. He should not think, I plowed and planted, and now I am harvesting. I am the one who produced the grain. Therefore, the Torah teaches him that he did not do it with his own strength. Rather, God gave him the sustenance, and everything comes from him. How is this lesson taught? To the fact that we give God the first and most precious portion of the grain. We thus admit that everything comes from God. When we connect the first portion to God, the first portion reflects on all the portions, and everything becomes sanctified. And this is a recurring theme that we have. What other firsts do we have that we make sure to give to God? Unmute. What other firsts do we give to God?
Pidyon haben.
Good. Pidyon haben, our firstborn son. We redeem that firstborn son from the Kohanim, from the service, right? Because, right? And good. What else? Well, when it comes to produce, we have the cheruma. That's the very thing, first thing that's taken off. That goes to the Kohanim. That goes to the Kohanim. We also have the bikurim, the first fruits. And those are also brought to the Beis HaMikdash. It's the very first, after working with something, the very first thing we have to it. We feel so proud and so connected, and we have to recognize that that is a gift from God. When Nana and I moved to Israel, so Israeli apartments don't have closets. A bedroom is four walls and a door through which to enter. There's no place to hang anything. There are no closets, no shelves whatsoever. They're not built into it. So we took a bed from the yeshiva that I was working at. We stood it up and we hung things from the bed. It was a little bit crazy. And then I took the wood from the lift, the crate that we had sent our belongings, and not being very handy at the time, I learned over my years in Israel, but I actually built a somewhat primitive, without electric tools, but I built a closet out of that wood. And it was simple, it was primitive, it was functional. And I was so proud of that because I worked on that, I toiled on that, and that was the first thing that I ever actually built like that. And that's how we feel. And I let Natalie know that she's in for a long ride, because I told her I'm now going to be painfully punny, both in Hebrew and in English. I put my arm around her and I said, we now have something we can call our own. Sorry, our own in Hebrew means a closet. Something we can call our own. Anyhow, right? So the mitzvah is to take that first thing that you toiled for, that you worked so hard at building. You worked so hard at growing. And we bring that to Hashem. That is the Omer offering that we bring. Rav Hirsch breaks it down a little bit further, showing how all the aspects of this. Oh, did I skip? No, we're good. Yeah. Rav Hirsch. He writes as follows. When you've attained not only freedom, which was the exodus from Egypt, but also national independence, which the possession of one's own land gives, but enter the land of Israel, and you cut the produce of the land, bring that which the land has produced into your own personal possession, then bring the first omer that you cut, the amount that corresponds to 1 day's food, to the Kohen, to your proxy, your representative in God's sanctuary. This cutting corresponds to the real harvest of the land, wheat, barley, oats, rye, spelt, meaning the staple with which people live. The omer is brought from barley. Why barley? Well, one reason, we'll see another reason later on, but one reason is that is the earliest grain to ripen. So therefore, that's the first of the grains to ripen. So that's the first of the firsts. That is what you bring. To the Omer, we mentioned in the verse in source number 1 from Vayikra, the law of tenufa, of waving, is added. Waving is like we do with our lulav and etrog on the Sukkot holiday. All 4 directions, and then up and then down, consisting of horizontal movements in all 4 directions, followed by moving upwards and downwards. What does that represent? By the procedure of waving. Now, the Omer was barley, but it wasn't just straight barley. A offering is typically, as this one is, the grain, in this case barley. It is oil, and also there is incense. Those are the 3 ingredients. So he explains the meaning of these three ingredients, what they represent, and thereby what the waving of them represents. By the procedure of waving, one's material nourishment, the basics, that's flour, one's well-being. Oil already is a wealthier aspect. That is our well-being. And one's mental satisfaction with life. Incense is a whole different, it's not a physical sustenance, but that's what brings this mental satisfaction to life, which are all represented in the Omer. By waving this, we are stripped of every idea of selfishness, meaning we recognize by waving in all directions up and down, it came from the heavens and it's for us to make sure that others also share in whatever gifts it is that God has given to us. Then this symbol of our earthly existence, with all its prosperity and joy of life, is placed in the temple to acknowledge that only through the Torah's ruling influence, through our connection to God, and through the Torah's guidance, pathway of that connection, can we find our dedication to the community, to others that we waved it around, and up and down, and to God. So that is the general idea of this mitzvah. Let's go now a little bit more to the nitty-gritty. So we had the Torah source of bringing the Korban Omer. We no longer have a Korban Omer to bring. And when there is no temple, there is no Korban Omer. So from the second day, on the day when that Omer offering would have been brought, that is when the new produce is allowed, one is allowed to eat. But the Torah commands us to start counting the days from that Omer offering that we just discussed. We're counting the days from the second day of Pesach. Why not from the first? We'll soon see. Until the evening before Shavuot, which will be the start of the 49th day. And then Shavuot is on the following day, on the 50th day. These days of the Omer are a time of preparation for Shavuot, which parallels between the Exodus from Egypt and giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. So let's see Vayikra, where we have that Torah commandment to count the Omer. Vayikra usfartem lachem, you shall count for you. Mimacharat haShabbat, and the lachem for you means this is not something that the Beit Din, but every individual does. Mimacharat haShabbat, from the day after that Shabbat, which is Pesach. Miyom aviachem et Omer Tnufa, from the day that you brought that Omer of Tnufa, of waving. Sheva Shabbatot Timimot Tiena. It'll be 7 complete weeks. Now, very often we'll begin Shabbos early. We'll begin a Yom Tov early. Why not bring on the Simcha earlier? Bring on the holiness earlier. But on Shavuot, we don't bring it on earlier. We wait because we need to count. What does it say? Sheva Shabbatot Timimot. 7 complete weeks. So we can't encroach upon even minutes of the end of those 7 weeks. We wait till the completion of those 7 weeks, and then we begin Shavuot. And here's the holiday. Here's the mitzvah, sorry. I'm Rachad Shabbat HaShviyit, until the day after the 7th week. Tisperu, you count, Chamishim Yom. You count 50 days. V'ikravtem mincha chadasha laHashem. And then you can bring a new flour offering for God. That is then the first mincha flour offering that is brought to God. We'll hear more about that later. So we see in Vayikra, source number 5, we have the mitzvah to count those days. Devarim, Deuteronomy tells us there's also a mitzvah to count the weeks. As we see, source number 6, Shiva Shavuot Tisporlach, 7 weeks you will count for you. Me'achel chermesh bekama, me'achel when you start the chermesh, the sickle, against the kama, against the standing grain. That's the start of the harvest. Tachel lispor, you will start to count 7 weeks. And therefore, when we count today, we didn't just count today as being the 12th day of the Omer. Today is 12 days, Shehem Shavua Echad V'Chamisha Yamim, which is 1 week and 5 days of the Omer. And right, Shabbos will be Arba'asar Yom, 14 days, which is Shnei Shavuot LaOmer, 2 weeks of the Omer. So we count both the days and the weeks, thereby fulfilling the mitzvah as is described both in Vayikra and in Devarim. Okay, so we know we have the special day coming. Why is it so important to verbalize the count and count each day? So Rambam, Maimonides, in his Moreh Nevuchim Guide for the Perplexed, writes as follows. Shavuot is the time of the giving of the Torah. There's no need for me to read it in Hebrew and then in English, because the Rambam wrote Moreh Nevuchim in Arabic, not in Hebrew or English. So anyhow, we're working with a translation over here, I believe. Shavuot is the time of the giving of the Torah. In order to honor and elevate this day, we count the days from the previous festival until it arrives. Like someone who is waiting for a loved one to arrive. You're all excited, right? I remember my kids, when my parents, Alayhim Hashalom, were coming to Israel to visit from the States. So they would count the days until would arrive. Like someone who's waiting for a loved one to arrive, who counts the days by the hours. This is the reason for counting the Omer from the day that we left Egypt until the day of the giving of the Torah, as this was the ultimate purpose of leaving Egypt. Egypt was not meant to be just a physical exodus, a physical deliverance. It was meant to be a spiritual exodus, a spiritual deliverance. And that culminated with Shavuot. I mentioned in a previous class a couple of days ago, the idea that there are those that view Pesach as being Yom Tov, Shavuot as being Yom Tov, and the days of Sphira being like the Chol HaMoed, the interim days between. This was the ultimate purpose of leaving Egypt. The pasuk says, "Vavi etchem elai," I shall bring you elai. I shall bring you. They say I should bring them. Etchem means you in the plural. It's hard, so they just went with them to make it plural, but it's actually y'all. I'll bring all of you elai. I'll bring all of you to me. So we're supposed to recognize that this is something that we must look forward to, anticipate, that we must bridge. And therefore we know that we are acted upon by our actions, and by the very act of counting that makes us feel the anticipation. However, source number 8, the Sefer HaChinuch, who goes through each of the mitzvot and explains many aspects of them, he asks, well, according to that, the reason that we count from the bringing of the Omer, so many days have passed in our counting, rather than counting how many days remain. Oh, if that's the case, right, we don't count towards the day that our loved one will arrive. We count how many days left until our loved one will arrive. So why then are we counting up? We should be counting down. See, he says it shows our great desire to reach the time of Shavuot. Meaning what? How's that? We do not want to mention the beginning of our counting. 49 days left, 48 days left, 47 days left, until we reach the offering of the 2 loaves on Shavuot. Right? We should not find it difficult to understand that once. Why? Because that would be very depressing. I got to wait 48 days, 47 days, 33. Oh gosh, it's so far off. I want it now. So that's why we don't want to start with the big number. We start with the small number. So he further persists and asks, if that's the case, maybe at the midway point we should switch gears. And at that point, we should say how many days left. And he writes, we should not find it difficult to understand that once we have passed halfway to the 7 weeks, we do not count down the few days remaining, as one should not change the nature of the counting in the middle. Once we started counting the way we did, so we will continue with that pattern. See, he says the reason we're counting up instead of counting down is because it would have been too depressing had we started counting down with so many days in between. We'll soon see another approach to that. But first he continues with number 8. Well, why do we begin counting from the day after Pesach and not from Pesach itself? If we want to connect Pesach and Shavuot, let's start counting from the very first day, from the day of Pesach itself, Passover itself, all the way to Shavuot. The answer is that the first day is entirely dedicated to remembering the great miracle of the Exodus from Egypt, which is a sign and evidence of the fact that God created the world and the existence of divine providence. Pesach is no slouch, is no pushover. Pesach laid down the fundamental principles of monotheism, of God's existence, and even more importantly, of God's active engagement, involvement, orchestration, and providence in this world. We may not. There's a Hebrew expression that he's working off. Ein ma'arvin simcha b'simcha. We don't mix one simcha with another simcha, right? So we don't want to detract from one simcha by bringing in another simcha. So we may not mix something else into that happiness and mention a different idea with it. As such, Pesach is the focus on Pesach, right? And in Israel, there is one day, first day of Pesach. There is Leil HaSeder. There is one Seder night that is observed. And once that day has been given all of its well-earned and deserved honor and focus, then the counting begins from the second day. Another approach as to why we count up instead of counting down. This is given by Rabbi Shimshon Pinchas in Nefesh Shimshon. And he writes as follows. When a person counts the days toward a certain day, the intervening days have no significance. For instance, a person who's expecting to receive a large gift at the end of 50 days views the days of waiting as 50 days that are interfering with my receipt of the gift. There's no power, there's no purpose to those days. They're just in my way. And when a day passes, only 49 days remain that separate him from the gift. And if he can go to sleep for 49 days and wake up on day 50 and receive the gift, perfect. That would be a real gift. But we relate to the days of Sfirat HaOmer very, very differently. These are not days that simply interfere with our receiving the Torah. These days are days of spiritual building. When a person builds a 10-story building, he counts each story. I have built one story. Now I can build the second story. Now I can build the third story. Let me cut to the chase. Let me build the 50th floor of my incredible apartment complex that I'm building. It doesn't work that way. Without the first 49 levels, you can't have a 50th floor. He doesn't say I have 9 stories left to build. He appreciates each level is a step on the way towards the goal that he hopes to attain. Similarly, on the days of Sfirat HaOmer, building and preparing ourselves for Matan Torah. God would be prepared to give us the Torah right away, but we are simply not yet ready. Therefore, we count the days of preparation and count the spiritual stories of our building, the spiritual levels, the spiritual floors of this building that prepares us for Matan Torah. And as people often say, we don't just count the days. We have to make sure that we make the days count, that they have to be of significance and that they bring us a step closer. And Judaism views everything as this building process, all the experiences of life. By Abraham, when he had his 10 challenges, it's not that why just give him the 10th challenge? If you pass the hardest one, of course you pass the easier ones, the lesser ones. That's not how it works. It was the strength that he gained from passing number 1 that enabled him to tackle number 2, and then number 3, and then number 4. And only after the first 9 was he able to stand up to the challenge of, according to most commentators, to the Akedah, which was the 10th one. And famously, according to Rabbeinu Yonah, the 10th one was not the Akedah. The 10th one was after the Akedah, and the death of Sarah, and the near death of Yitzchak. And he has to deal with the people of the Chitim, of Ephron, to buy Marat HaMachpelah, to buy that which we now call the tomb of the patriarchs in Hebron. And they're draying him around, turning it into a bargaining, hawking session, and he remains calm and respectful and deferential. That was his greatest nisayon. But either way, however we view it, the challenges in life build us for the next one. And each of these days is meant to help us build for the next one so that we can ultimately be ready for a meaningful Kabbalat Torah, accepting the Torah on Shavuot. Because as we always say, the Jewish calendar is not that we are commemorating it was on this day back in the year 2448 of the Jewish calendar. That is when God appeared on Mount Sinai. That is true. But the real significance is that same potential, that same energy that manifested itself fully that year with God's revelation on Mount Sinai, that returns again every year on Shavuot. And that is the time for each and every one of us to have special siyata d'shmaya, special divine help towards our own personal Kabbalat HaTorah, receiving of the Torah. The Torah blessing, the blessing on the mitzvah of Torah study that we make each day is V'natan lanu et Torato, right? God has given to us his Torah. That is a giving to us. And we also say, V'tein chalkenu b'Toratecha, give us our portion in your Torah. Each and every person has their unique chelek, their understandings, their of Torah that are unique to them. That is their chelek, that is their portion. We mentioned before that we go from barley, a barley Omer offering that's brought on Shavuot, and then that culminates on the 50th day on Shavuot that we bring loaves of bread made from wheat. And we quoted the Sefer HaChinuch, we learned the Sefer HaChinuch, who says the reason why it's brought from barley is because that is the first of the 5 grains to ripen, to be ready for harvesting. That is true. There's also a deeper understanding, and that is source number 9 from Master Plan, Rabbi Aryeh Carmel. The Omer on Pesach was from the barley harvest. The offering on Shavuot was of wheat. Barley is mainly food for animals. Wheat is food for human beings. The Torah hints to us that physical independence by itself still leaves man, from the Torah perspective, on the animal level. It's not enough to be physically free. The counting of the 49 days signifies a sevenfold refining process and marks our progress to exalted human status with our acceptance of the Torah at Sinai 7 weeks after the Exodus. A person who's able to control themselves, funnel their energies in the right direction, and control different aspects when they need to be controlled, that is a person who is operating on a very exalted level. Because so one of these books tells a story. Two guys were buddies, and they made a deal that whoever leaves the world first would come to the other one in a dream and tell them about the afterlife. All right, and one of them dies and comes to the other one and says, "It's amazing. I eat whenever I want to eat. I sleep whenever I want to sleep." And his friend said to him, "Is that the afterlife?" And he said, "No, I came back as a cow in Omaha." Right? We want to live our life in a way that it's more than just the eating and the sleeping and the working in order to eat and then sleep. Right? There must be more to it than that. And that is the Shavuot, the Torah at Sinai, which gives us the direction, gives all of mankind, whether one is Jewish or non-Jewish, whether it's the 613 or the 7 mitzvot, it gives us the direction as to how to live an exalted, godly life during the time that we are gifted here in this world. And it's also interesting to note that one of my students a couple of years ago called me up, a student from years and years ago. He goes, "Rabbi, how are we bringing the Omer on the second day of Pesach? Right? The Omer is barley. That's one of the grains. Right? You can't have that on Pesach." I said to him, "Did you have any matzah?" He said, "Yeah, of course." I said, "What's the matzah made of?" "It's one of the grains. How are you having that?" But most of the meal offerings were matzah, not chametz. So the barley offering was an offering made that was matzah. It was not chametz. It's only on Shavuot that we have, it's one of the rare times that we bring actual chametz as an offering, also lachmei toda. But Shavuot is one of the times that we bring actual chametz, loaves of bread, as the offering. And that too is the same idea, that we are meant to be engaged, involved in this world. Judaism is not being an ascetic and leaving the world behind. Rather, we get ourselves involved in the world when we have the Torah as our guide, as our boundaries, as the parameters. I remember Rav Shach of blessed memory came to speak at the yeshiva that I was teaching at in Israel. And he said, the Torah never says no. The Torah never says no. It tells you how, when, and where. It gives you the parameters, right? Yes, be involved. Marriage, intimate relations, how, where, when. We don't view a priest or a nun, someone who takes on an oath of celibacy, we don't view that as a positive. Yes, involve yourself in wine, in making a l'chaim. Make kiddush over wine every Friday night. How, when, where, as opposed to Islam, where any intoxicating alcoholic beverages are forbidden. Involve yourself in the world, but be mikadesh, sanctify it, uplift it. And therefore, once we have the Torah, have the chametz. Bring the chametz. Be involved in all this world offers, but do it in the proper manner. Okay, my friends. Yasher koach, everybody. Good seeing you all. And have a good rest of the day. Have a good Shabbos. Hope to see you or some of you, those who can, in person. And we have to get back to our discussion about reinstating Lunch and Learn in person. Okay. If any of you would like to send me a note or an email about your thoughts on that, I would very much like to get the lunch back into the learn over here. Okay, we're only operating at a 50% over here. Okay, everybody.
Thank
A
you.
good day and a good Shabbos. You're very, very welcome.
You too. Bye-bye.
Be well.